leading.
This is an NBC News special report. Here's Lester Holt.
Good day, everyone. We're coming on the air with breaking news. Just moments from now, President Biden is expected to make remarks about the recent spate of high-altitude objects shot down by the U.S. military over North America. A total of 4 have been brought down in the past 2 weeks, but we really only know anything about the first one, shot down February 4th and later recovered off the coast of South Carolina. U.S. officials say that was a Chinese spy balloon. The Chinese say it was a weather monitoring aircraft that drifted off course. 3 other unidentified objects were then brought down since then, one in the icy waters off northwestern Alaska, another in Canada's Yukon, and a third in Lake Huron. Recovery missions for all those are underway, but hampered by weather conditions and difficult terrain. But exactly what they are and where they came from remain a bit of a mystery. Let's go to our chief White House correspondent, Kristen Welker, right now. Kristen, the president has taken some dings from both sides of the aisle over transparency in all this.
He absolutely has, Lester, and these remarks come amid that mounting pressure for him to address the American people and to give some information about the Chinese spy balloon and those 3 unidentified objects.
And here's the president.
Last week, in the immediate aftermath of the incursion by China's high-altitude balloon, our military, through the North American Aerospace Defense Command, so-called NORAD, closely scrutinized our airspace, including enhancing our radar to pick up more slow-moving objects above our country, around the world. In doing so, they tracked 3 unidentified objects, one in Alaska, Canada, and over Lake Huron in the Midwest. They acted in accordance with established parameters for determining how to deal with unidentified aerial objects in U.S. airspace. At their recommendation, I gave the order to take down these 3 objects due to hazards to civilian commercial air traffic and because we could not rule out the surveillance risk of sensitive facilities. We acted in consultation with the Canadian government. I spoke personally with Prime Minister Trudeau from Canada on Saturday. And just as critically, we acted out of an abundance of caution and an opportunity that allowed us to take down these objects safely. Our military and the Canadian military are seeking to recover the debris so we can learn more about these 3 objects. Our intelligence committee is still assessing all 3 incidences. They're reporting to me daily and will continue their urgent efforts to do so, and I will communicate that to the Congress. We don't yet know exactly what these 3 objects were, but nothing right now suggests they were related to China's spy balloon program or that they were surveillance vehicles from any other country. The Intelligence Committee's current assessment is that these 3 objects were most likely balloons tied to private companies, recreation or research institutions studying weather or conducting other scientific research. When I came into office, I instructed our intelligence community to take a broad look at the phenomenon of unidentified aerial objects. We know that a range of entities, including countries, companies, and research organizations, operate objects at altitudes for purposes that are not nefarious, including legitimate scientific research. I want to be clear. We don't have any evidence that there has been a sudden increase in the number of objects in the sky. We're now just seeing more of them, partially because the steps we've taken to increase our radars, to narrow our radars. And we have to keep adapting our approach to dealing with these challenges. That's why I've directed my team to come back to me with sharper rules for how we will deal with these unidentified objects moving forward, distinguishing between those that are likely to pose safety and security risks that necessitate action and those that do not. But make no mistake, if any object presents a threat to the safety and security of the American people, I will take it down. I'll be sharing with Congress these classified policy parameters when they're completed, and they'll remain classified so we don't give our roadmap to our enemies to try to evade our defenses. Going forward, these parameters will guide what actions we'll take while responding to unmanned and unidentified aerial objects. We're going to keep adapting them as the challenges evolve. It evolves. In addition, I've directed my national security advisor to lead a government-wide effort to make sure we are positioned to deal safely and effectively with the objects in our airspace. First, we will establish a better inventory of unmanned airborne objects in space above the United States airspace and make sure that inventory is accessible and up to date. Second, we'll implement further measures to improve our capacity to detect unmanned objects in our airspace. Third, we'll update the rules and regulations for launching and maintaining unmanned objects in the skies above the United States of America. And fourth, my Secretary of State will lead an effort to help establish common global norms in this largely unregulated space. These steps will lead to safer and more secure skies for our air travelers, our military, our scientists, and for people on the ground as well. That's my job as your President, Commander-in-Chief. As the events of the previous days have shown, we'll always act to protect the interest of the American people and the security of the American people. Since I came to office, we've developed the ability to identify, track, and study high-altitude surveillance balloons connected with the Chinese military. When one of these high-altitude surveillance balloons entered our airspace over the continental United States earlier in the month, I gave the order to shoot it down as soon as it would be safe to do so. The military advised against shooting it down over land because of the sheer size of it. It was the size of multiple school buses and it posed a risk to people on the ground if it was shot down where people lived. Instead, we tracked it closely, we analyzed its capabilities, and we learned more about how it operates. And because we knew its path, we were able to protect sensitive sites against collection. We waited until it was safely over water, which would not only protect civilians, but also enable us to recover substantial components for further analytics. And then we shot it down, sending a clear message. The violation of our sovereignty is unacceptable. We'll act to protect our country, and we did. Now, this past Friday, we put restrictions on 6 firms that directly support the People's Republic Liberation Army, People's Liberation Army aerospace program that includes airships and balloons, denying them access to U.S. technology. We briefed our diplomatic partners and our allies around the world, and we know about China's program and where their balloons have flown. Some of them have also raised their concerns directly with China. Our exports have lifted components of the Chinese balloon's payload off the ocean floor. We're analyzing them as I speak, and what we learn will strengthen our capabilities. Now, we'll also continue to engage with China, as we have throughout the past 2 weeks. As I've said since the beginning of my administration, we seek competition, not conflict with China. We're not looking for a new Cold War, but I make no apologies, and we will compete. And we'll responsibly manage that competition so that it doesn't veer into conflict. This episode underscores the importance of maintaining open lines of communication between our diplomats and our military professionals. Our diplomats will be engaging further, and I will remain in communication with President Xi. I'm grateful for the work of the last several weeks of our intelligence, diplomatic, and military professionals who have proved once again to be the most capable in the world. And I want to thank you all. Now look, the other thing I want to point out is that we are going to keep our allies and the Congress contemporaneously informed of all we know and all we learn. And I expect to be speaking with President Xi, and I hope we are going to get to the bottom of this. But I make no apologies for taking down that balloon. Thank you very much.
Sir, the question was it? There's been criticism. There's been criticism that this was. There's been criticism that this.
China compromised by your family's business relations.
Sir, Mr. President, there has been criticism.
Did you overreact?
Mr. President, there has been criticism that this was an overreaction that was done because of political pressure.
Okay. You can come to my office and ask the question when you have more polite people.
Mr. President, why have you chosen Poland for your trip to mark anniversary of the war? And what's your message?
When are you speaking to President Xi, Mr. President?
President not engaged. The president not engaging in any answers or to the questions being shouted as he left the room there. The president really providing more about what we don't know what we do know about those three most recent objects, saying that they do not appear to be part of the Chinese balloon program, that they may very well likely be private in origin, recreational, or involved in some sort of research. They are still trying to collect the debris from those three most recent. The U.S. continues to say that the Chinese were sponsors of that first balloon, that first larger balloon that crisscrossed the United States. Our chief White House correspondent, Kristen Welker, joins me now. Kristen?
That's right, Lester, and one of the headlines came at the very end when the president said that he expects to speak with President Xi. This is significant because the president and the vice president have signaled that this incident in shooting down the Chinese spy balloon will not mark a shift in relations with China. You heard the president say that he wants the relationship between these two global superpowers to be competitive, but that this is not going to be a break. So we'll continue to monitor that. In terms of the other headlines, it was very notable that he said those three objects that were shot down over the weekend, they have now assessed are balloons that they believe were tied, as you said, to private companies, potentially for meteorological purposes or research scientific purposes. You also heard him talk about the fact that he has directed an interagency review to basically write up new rules of the road to make the skies safer. They will continue, he said, to brief Congress on those findings. His Secretary of State also charged with being a part of that, as well as trying to make the skies over the global community safer. Now, in terms of the three objects that were shot down over the weekend, you heard him talk about the fact that they are trying to recover some of the debris. But Lester, I can tell you, based on my conversations here, that has been a real challenge, a big question mark over whether they will be able to do that and get to the bottom of it. And finally, you heard him reiterate that he gave the direction to shoot down the Chinese spy balloon when it was safe to do so. Now, again, this comes amid growing calls for more information from Republicans and Democrats who say there hasn't been enough transparency. Lester?
All right, Kristen, thank you. Let me go to NBC News Pentagon correspondent Courtney Kuby. She's in Munich, Germany, where world leaders are meeting at a security conference. Courtney, the president talked about this need to set new parameters. Obviously, we can't imagine a world in which everything that's unidentified gets shot down immediately. Is there a pressure within the military to come up with some hard, fast rules of how they react to these?
And I think this is not just going to be for the military, but this will be a wider, including the FAA, a decision about not just changing the radar parameters again, but looking at some of these smaller, maybe slower moving objects, and rather than immediately scrambling jets, but having some sort of a specific checklist of what to do. But I have to say, Lester, there were two things that really stuck out to me in the president's remarks. One was the very last line that he said before he walked away, and that was that he makes no apologies for shooting down that balloon. He didn't mention the other three objects. He specifically was saying he didn't apologize for shooting down the one balloon. Didn't say anything about whether he thought that it was an overreaction or potentially a mistake to shoot down the three follow-on objects. In addition to that, when he talked about the continuing efforts and communications, there was no mention there of the fact that the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, tried reaching out to his Chinese counterpart before the U.S. shot down that high-altitude Chinese surveillance balloon, and the Chinese didn't pick up the phone. The mill-to-mill hotline that has existed for years now has been shut down, essentially, the Chinese not answering the phone. And that's a real danger, according to military officials. They are very worried about the potential for some sort of a miscalculation. Think about the fact that the Chinese are operating things in international airspace, and so is the U.S., but the Chinese consider a lot of this airspace and waterways to be their territorial areas. So if there is no military-to-military communication and there's a U.S. asset in one of those areas the Chinese see as their own, without that sort of deconfliction mechanism or line, it has the potential to have a real problem here, Lester. I was surprised we didn't hear from President Biden specifically about that, because Secretary Austin has expressed his concerns about the potential dangers of that hotline not existing right now.
All right, Courtney, thank you. I'll ask you to stand by. Let me go to Admiral James Stavridis. He's NBC's Chief International Security and Diplomacy Analyst. Admiral, the President and others have talked about radar capabilities, that they're not set for slow-moving objects. They are now. What are we giving up in exchange, though? Obviously, the radar parameters were set at what they were for a reason.
Lester, the thing to focus on here is that detection is not just a single system. It's not just the radar at Cheyenne Mountain, in and around NORAD itself, the North American Air Defense. Detection is a function of what your satellites see overhead, what your intelligence feed is going in, what your radars all across the Pacific indicate to you, those over the Alaskan coast as well. You've got to be able to knit it together. And I think the challenge here for the administration is going to be to find ways to respond in these slower moving scenarios, because as you say, it's been set for the high fast burner, as we would call it. So what that means is that you've got a tactical challenge to kind of retrain your operators. You've got an operational integration challenge to put all those pieces I mentioned together. And then, as we've been discussing, there's a strategic challenge here in the sense that you've got to be able to respond quickly, rapidly, but in a way that doesn't create real escalation, for example, with China, because we are collecting on China. We don't send balloons over China, but we are close by China collecting, so there could be back and forth. That's a worry. And to conclude, this is why those open lines of communication, the ability to call counterparts, so important. I had that as Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. I could call my Russian counterpart at any moment. Lloyd Austin, as Secretary of Defense, has got to be able to reach out to the Pacific, to the Russians, everywhere. Disconcerting that the Chinese refused to take his call.
Yeah, Admiral, thanks. And Kristen, before we wrap up here, what do you suspect in terms of whether this will satisfy some of the calls in Congress for more information about all this?
I think the calls are going to continue to grow for more information, Lester. There's no doubt about that. And part of the pressure to deliver these remarks in the first place is that this vacuum of information was giving way to conspiracy theories. For example, a few days ago, the White House press secretary came out and said, look, this is not the result of extraterrestrial activity. The U.S. is not under some type of broader threat, Lester. So the pressure mounts here.
All right, Kristen, thanks. That concludes our special report. Much more tonight on NBC Nightly News. I'm Lester Holt in New York. Good day, everyone.